think the main problem in the design is that in many countries, they're not sector specific. So you have local content strategies that encompass not only the oil and gas sector or not only the mining sector, but that apply to all sectors of the economy. One good example is employment requirements. So in some countries that I've worked in, they require, let's say, 90% of national employers. Obviously, for like an investment project in agriculture, for example, where the skill level needed might be lower and where the skills are available in the country, this local content target is easy to accomplish and maybe too easy. But if you're working an oil rig where you require very, very high skill sets and that country doesn't have those skill sets because it's a newly producing country, then that sector won't be able to meet that target. So that's number one. Number two in the design phase, I think, is trying to avoid loopholes. Or one good example, again, is the definition of, for example, what is a local company? Is it a company that is based in the country? Is it a company that adds value in the country? How do you define local content? Because what you may want to achieve as a policymaker with your local content policy is to increase value addition in country. But if you define local content as a company being situated in your country, what you might end up having is countries from abroad setting up a small office in your country and using that company as an import point. But because you're then based in the country, you resell that product to the company and you count as local content. So that's, I think, the second major issue with the design phase. And then the third big issue that I foresee in the design phase is complying with the investment agreements, the international investment agreements that most countries have signed up to. So the WTO agreements that most countries are part of limit some sort of local content rules that you can apply. And then bilateral investment treaties that are often signed with other countries tend to have even stricter regulations as to what sort of local content regulations you can impose. And you as a country can be taken to court if you violate those agreements. So on the implementation phase, I think the biggest issue is the coordination issue between government agencies and among different stakeholders. So, we have experience from our research that it's not actually that important whether local content regulation is binding or not, but rather how well the different institutions work together in achieving targets that they both set and try to meet. So I think that's probably one of the most important aspects in terms of implementation. And setting the right targets. If you set targets too high, you won't achieve them. And if you set them too low, then obviously it won't help you to move up in the skill level that you aim to achieve through local content.
Whereas local content can be very beneficial, it is also very challenging to make it work. If you have a local content policy that is not based on the current industry capacity and human capital that you have in your country, it will most likely fail. You need to have a look at what you have at the moment and how you can turn that capacity and competency easy into serving the petroleum industry. Moreover, what we see also is that if people are setting up requirements that are too strict, too rigid, then it will be impossible for the industry to comply, or maybe just make it more difficult. And then this will impact the efficiency and the profitability of petroleum activities. So that means that in certain cases, you can see that the total impact of the local content requirements might impact the profitability of the industry, and that will also decrease the investors' interest in the country. So it is important that you adapt your requirements to the country specific context. You cannot take one regime from one country and just export it to the next. And it's also very important that you establish a dialogue with the industry, because if you don't know what their challenges are in complying with the requirements, then it's most likely that you will fail as a host country to have the correct local content requirements. There is also danger that you might induce corruption, because if the local content requirements are so strict or impossible to comply with, then people might try to take quick solutions instead of complying correctly.
I mean, to my mind, maybe it's worth looking at it from both sides, right? First from the country perspective and then from the company perspective. I think from the country perspective, it doesn't really change that much. The contracts being awarded by the oil and gas companies may be smaller because they're trying to reduce their costs, but ultimately you're still trying to, as a government, to develop the local expertise and create that industrial base. The other aspect you might want to consider when thinking around that is, what are the other benefits from oil and gas extraction? And if it's fiscal revenues, then that obviously takes a huge hit during the commodity price fall. So if you compare those two in that sense, the local content versus revenue argument, there the local content actually gains weight in terms of importance to a country, given that fiscal revenues are likely to be even greater negatively affected than the local content linkages. And then from a company's perspective, I also don't think that it fundamentally changes the company's perspective on local content. It's still a very significant contributor to gaining or retaining the social license to operate. So in that sense, it's important for mining and oil and gas companies to show that they're contributing to the development of the country beyond providing revenues. And then it might actually create an opportunity to save costs, because there may be more pressure to break up large tenders that previously seemed to be too tedious to break up because prices were high, and taking a small, getting a little bit less worth for money before might not have been as important as it is now. But of course, if local content is a big cost to the oil and gas and mining companies, then they will be looking to trying to address that. But I personally don't think that the price fall changes the importance of local content.
My argument is that a petro-developmental state encourages development through two things. Firstly, good and productive investment of petroleum revenues, and then secondly, the local content policy. And this is important because for decades we thought that the only way a country could have development through natural resources was from the revenues that would flow to the state. But that the experience is that never led to development, and in fact it was more of a curse. Local content can be a curse too if it's not implemented well, but I think actually of the two strategies, the more important one is local content. And the recent fall in commodity prices underscores this. I think it makes it more evident because commodity prices, especially the price of oil, are inherently very volatile. and they're always going to create a lot of difficulties in predicting revenues and planning investment. So on top of that, you have troubles with Dutch disease, and using the revenues wisely requires the whole of government to function very effectively. The benefits of local content policies, on the other hand, are roughly the same, and they're going to stay the same as long as the exploration and production activities continue, because you require the same inputs and it offers the same opportunities for local participation. So the developmental benefit is more even, and local content policies can actually encourage diversification away from oil and gas, whereas relying on the revenues encourages the formation of rentier states. So I think that the fall in commodity prices recently has just underlined why this second strategy of local content is so important for petrodevelopment. And what I think it shows is that a country should pursue as much local content as possible through hard regulation and mandatory requirements, up to the point that additional regulation would actually discourage the company that is investing from making a decision to go ahead with the project. And in fact, I would tell most countries in most circumstances that they should take lower revenues if they could have increased and strengthened local content requirements that would not discourage the investment decision. And that's going to be politically difficult because the revenues are something the government requires to immediately deliver some sort of benefit to their own citizens. So there are political considerations. My advice might change slightly if I thought the country was more capable of managing oil revenues well, if they had a track record, or it might change as well. You might have to think about alternatives to local content if the size of the reserves are very small, if they are very difficult to extract, or it's more costly to extract. Then I think you have to think about other alternatives to local content, like use of the revenues. But otherwise, local content is really crucial for achieving petrodevelopment and from diversifying away from oil in preparation for a transition to a lower carbon global economy.
Local content might increase the costs of the services that you have providing services to your petroleum activities and your IOCs. So considering if that's true, then local content will eat up a bit more of the margins of the companies and therefore decrease the profitability in the project. Now, that's a challenge at any time. However, in the current low price scenario, this will impact the industry's interest in your country even more. This is why it is a benefit to have flexible local content requirements rather than strict prescriptive requirements, because you would want to have a look at what you really want out of your petroleum industry. Is it that you would like to have local content at any cost? Or is it that you want to prefer to collect as much as you can in tax revenues, production shares, etc.? As for the alternatives, I think the only alternative would be to have a constant, flexible approach to this. You need a dialogue between the host country and the international oil companies. You need efficient supervision and enforcement as well in order to make sure that your regime is working well.